Well, I'm super excited for this conversation and just want to say thank you again. Really privileged to speak with you about your 20s and best advice. As I explained to you yesterday when we spoke, I love to start at the beginning for my interviews. So let's talk about your college days, because I saw that you got three very interesting degrees from three very different schools. First off, a BS in psychology from Michigan. Go Blue, of course. You went to get a neuroscience degree from Yale and an MBA from the University of San Francisco. I'm curious how all of these experiences prepared you for the trajectory of your career.
Yeah, I would say that I'm very kind of grateful for these different evolutionary stages, right? So, in a way, like one of the things that's fascinating is that you always kind of have to go back to your childhood to sort of realize, what you're kind of truly deeply fascinated by. So, I've always been kind of fascinated by computers and personal computing. I had this kind of 8-bit like computer, the Atari 400, and 16K of RAM, and just this kind of little wacky computer, and I spent a ton of time on there, like building software and just having a hell of a good time, right? So, in a sense, the thing that happened as a happenstance is that I went to a local university because I grew up in Michigan, right? So I went to University of Michigan, right? It was pretty nice, in-state tuition, good school. It turns out that they had a number 2 ranked psychology department and a I think 54 ranked computer science department. So, despite my interest in like computers, like I really ended up gravitating towards psychology because it had such a strong psych department, right? So in a sense, like, as you're kind of forging your path, you really have to kind of reconcile your own interests with what's available. The thing I didn't really know at the time is that I actually am a very strange temperament. If you go to 16personalities.com, they have the version of the Myers-Briggs
Mm-hmm.
personality inventory, right? So it turns out that I'm a INFP, right, which is alternatingly called the mediator or the healer temperament, right? So in a sense, like what I really kind of do and naturally is I kind of try to understand people and I try to kind of communicate to people about either other people, which is the mediator effect, right, or about themselves, which is the healer effect, right? So as a mediator, I'm like Alice, don't you understand how Bob is feeling, right? And then as a healer, I'm like, Bob, do you understand what Bob is feeling, right? And and then that can change Bob, right? Bob can be like, oh, I didn't even understand myself, right? So so the all of these things kind of gravitated me naturally towards like psychology, but the thing that was so interesting is I grew up in a scientific family. So like my dad was like a scientist. My brother became a scientist and like, so I was very much kind of like on a scientific track, right? So
Mm-hmm.
because of that, I ended up going towards the most scientific form of psychology, right? Which was the neuroscience track. So I ended up going to Yale neuroscience and I ended up studying the brain, which is super interesting. A lot of what I ended up doing was abstract neural network computation, which is sort of what now is being called deep learning and AI, right? So in a way, I'm really surprised to be involved in sort of blockchain venture capital because in a way I kind of have more of an AI background, right? But in a sense, like, life is very full of kind of twists and turns. So, I would say like, that was kind of like this very interesting and protracted journey for me.
I love that you mentioned right there. I mean, life is full of a lot of twists and turns, and us 20 somethings have to deal with a lot right now. Everybody obviously is having to deal with the pandemic, but it's increasingly difficult for you younger people to try and figure out, where our places in life are and what we need to be working on right now during this moment of uncertainty. I'm curious, to hear about like a moment of uncertainty that you had to deal with in your 20s that you think really helped with the overall growth of your personal and professional career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think actually leaving graduate school was kind of really epic for me, right? Because in a way, like one of the things that happened to me in my journey, right, is that I mentioned that my dad was a scientist. Like he really kind of like was super passionate about science and in a way like he didn't himself didn't know of any other life, right? So one of the things that it's pretty obvious if you're looking at the video is, like I'm an Asian guy, Japanese, origin. And so, in a way, like one of the things that's so interesting is kind of the power of the family elders, right? So in a sense, we're kind of taught through the Confucius method that our parents are kind of almost godlike, right? So in a sense, like my dad was very, very like revered figure in my life, you know, and so for him, like, you know, for me to be like leaving a PhD program was kind of like this huge struggle, right? Because in a way, he didn't really see any other path for survival, even for himself or for me, right? I ended up having this amazing conversation with a professor, you know, and he kind of asked me this really challenging question, right? Which, and I, to this day, I don't know if it was personal or not personal, but he said to me, like, what are you doing here? You know, and I was like, oh, this doesn't sound good, you know? And then he's kind of like, you should be out exploring the world. You should be like climbing mountains. Like you should be like going and seeing, you know, whatever you can see, right? And the thing that was really shocking to me about this conversation, you know, obviously if it was personal, he's like, you know, it's like, what specifically are you doing here? Like you obviously don't belong here. That's one way to read it, right? But the other way to read it is that he was just kind of maybe kind of offering a little nudge, right? And being like, you know, if you really have the passion to be here, you're just going to ignore me, right? So you know, I should just encourage you and see what happens, right? And you know, but to me it was shocking. Like I was kind of like, I'm here because this is the only possible thing that anyone could ever do in the world, right? And you know, it's just a great lack of imagination, you know. But that was a huge struggle for me, like probably one of the hardest things I ever did, because I was so kind of like, you know, wrapped around this worldview of like, you
Mhm.
know, what I had to become.
Of course, because there's a lot of pressure. It could be from family, friends, you know, seeing what other people are doing. Really, I think that if you find something that you're passionate about and you think that you have a greater purpose doing something else, it's worth following that, of course, because there's always, you know, financial risk. There's always a lot of risk in starting something new, taking a new path, but there's also spiritual risks in not doing something that you believe is really your calling. So let's talk about, you know, what you felt like was your calling. I understand that you fell in love with open source software 25 years ago, and that really, you know, propelled your career, you know, within this space. You know, you worked at a company called Sun Microsystems. I'm curious, you know, talking about those early days working at Sun Microsystems, and just what made you so interested in software, in computers, in studying this.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's so interesting when you start to kind of find your individual voice and your individual calling is really that you kind of get the fire, you know, because like in a way, like there's life is full of fire, right? And in a way, like it's either you're gonna get the fire from the inside or like someone else is gonna light a fire under your butt up on the outside, right? So like those are your choices, right? Because I don't think like, oh, I'm just gonna opt out of the whole fire thing. Like it's like no, that's not on the table, right? So in a sense, you gotta figure out where your internal fire is, right? And one of the things that happened to me that was just very fortuitous is like, you know, I was working kind of it was really interesting. I got to San Francisco and I was working at Wired magazine, which at the time was an independent magazine. And they actually had a whole division that was focused on the internet. And so I was working there and I was kind of in a late night working on some software. You know, I ran across this cool programming language, Java programming language, right? And I ended up building this kind of system, and the whole thing was compiled down to like 14K, right? And I had this crazy thing. I was like late night, and I realized the whole thing I was working on could fit on like my old Atari 400 computer, which is like super underpowered, right? But so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking like I just had this aha moment. So like in a way, like I just started excitedly talking about this technology, right? And eventually what happened was that like Sun, who was the creator of the technology, like they wanted to hire me, right? Because they were like, this guy is more excited about this stuff than we are. So like, you know, so in a way, like once you kind of find your inner passion, you kind of find your voice, right? So, you know, and then you kind of like go out there, right? You just go out into the world, you know, and the thing that's so amazing is conviction is infectious, right? So that's the kind of secret lesson for me in venture capital, right? Which is conviction is almost everything, right? So in a sense, like especially in blockchain, by the way, right? Because blockchain is basically everybody gets to print money, right? So if you print money, then everyone has to ask you like, well, why is this money, right? I mean, it could
Hmm.
just be a bunch of bits. It could just be zeros and ones that have no meaning, right? And it's definitely not money, right? And ultimately it's kind of like it's money because I believe it is, right? And then, now there's reasons people can be convinced that it's money because they can use it to buy something, right? But if they buy something, then the person who's selling is actually accepting whatever it is you're giving as money, right? So my point is
Of
that
course.
you create an entire economy, right? And the creation of an economy requires conviction. So what I'm really talking about at the end of the day is conviction, right? And the thing that's amazing as the VC is there's a class of conviction called entrepreneurial conviction. And what entrepreneurial conviction is I can't even think about anything other than what I think is going to happen, right? I'm so convinced that this thing I'm working on is the thing and it's going to happen that I like every other thought and every like even going to the bathroom feels like a waste of time, right? It's like, no, I gotta work on this thing, so like that's the kind of conviction that I think creates entrepreneurship. Now here's my point: is you could have a life and a really interesting life without that level of conviction, because that's a conviction that borders on like madness, right? Because generally you're convinced of something that most people, and at some point probably almost all people, aren't. But what happens next? Like what happens is that you bring that conviction to someone else, right? So you're like, you'll never believe what I discovered, and then you start describing it. And the thing that becomes really interesting is, what does your voice sound like? Right? Like, what does it sound like when you're describing this thing? Right? And in a way, like, this world is kind of like there's a limited number of kind of leaders and a larger number of followers, right? So in a
Of
sense,
course.
like, but there's honor in being all of the above, right? Like in a sense, like what's funny about being an investor is an investor's definitely not a leader, right? An investor's definitely a follower, right? Because we follow entrepreneurs, right? So, my feeling is that like, you can definitely forge your own path, right? But I think that there's no escape from conviction, right? And conviction is basically like, this is what I think matters. This is what I think is gonna happen. This is, that's where it all comes from, right? So in a sense, you got to get your believies on.
Of course, no, conviction is key, and that's why it's amazing. It's a great feeling to find communities of people who have similar conviction and believe in similar things as well. First off, I loved hearing about your aha moment as well. Really enjoyed hearing about your time at Wired Magazine. I don't know if you know this, but I interviewed Ev Williams a few months ago, and his aha
Amazing.
moment was reading the first edition of Wired Magazine. That's what made him move from Nebraska to Silicon Valley to pursue the internet. So, like, crazy connection hearing that you were also.
I love that. It's funny actually. In the early days, pre-Twitter, he actually created
Yep.
blogger.com,
Yeah.
right? And what's funny about that was I actually sold their first enterprise license to Sun Microsystems. So I
No
actually
way.
was, yeah. So it was really so it's so funny. Like, so those were definitely like the early days of that whole like web,
That's hilarious.
internet.
You guys were our age, like trying to figure out
Oh,
this internet thing, and now we
that's
have
what it
so many young
was.
people trying to figure out Web3 and just the future of the internet, which we're gonna get to. And that would have been a perfect pivot for that. But right before we get to kind of your thoughts on why you're so bullish on Bitcoin and why you think more 20 somethings should be excited about the internet, I want to talk about your perspective as an investor as well. You started investing early, began as an angel investor. I happened to made my first angel investment last year. I know there are a lot of young people who, are busy on Robinhood trying to understand the world of investing, how to do it, where to start. I'm curious, like, how many companies, if you're interested in sharing, did you invest in your 20s? And what is your advice for investors that are interested in starting out?
Yeah, so I was not actively investing. I actually I earned my lumps. Like one of the crazy things I did back then was I invested in Apple stock, which sounds like a great idea, right? But then what happened was that the stock price went down further, Like it was already way down, right? Because this is post Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs left, and
Yep.
some company was like drowning, right? And they just had like it was just like a clown car. Like it kept getting worse and worse, right? So I ended up selling all of it at a loss, which is like so amazing. Like it's such an amazing, and to me, like, it's so funny because my life experience from that is this, it really has to do with conviction, right? And it has to do with thesis, right? Which is I'm what I call a thesis investor, right? So if you have a thesis, right, and your thesis isn't broken, then don't sell, right?
Mhm.
Like buy high, sell low is definitely not a thing, right? Like that's not how you do it, right? So in a way, like this has helped me a lot with things like Bitcoin, right? Because Bitcoin does that all the time. It goes down like, oh, it just went down by 50%, right? And
Yep.
it's kind of like what you should do is go back to your thesis and be like, do I still think that that's what's going to happen, right? And if there's something fundamentally broken, right? Like for let's say some cryptographer breaks Bitcoin and they're like, "Hey, I figured out how to open everyone's wallet," right? So that it's like, okay, your thesis is broken, right?
Sure.
Like, okay, you
And
can
that's
sell
fine.
now.
That's
You can
fine. You
sell
know,
now. You can
accept.
sell
Yeah.
now, right? But like,
Yes.
but and I'm even joking about that, right? Because it's actually Satoshi even came up with a plan if that happens, right? Which is he said if anyone ever breaks SHA-256, which is the cryptography, he basically said what you do is you freeze the blockchain so no further transactions can be made, right? And then what you do is you just replace the signing algorithm and then you start it up again, right? So the thing that's amazing is that even if someone hacked Bitcoin, it wouldn't be the end of Bitcoin, right? But what I'm saying is like, I don't know, there's some scenario, uh, aliens remove the
Sure.
internet or whatever it is, like
Which
there's
at
some
this
story.
point, at this point can happen. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah. But
kidding.
I guess the thing I'm trying to say is if your thesis ain't broke, like, don't sell.
No, that's a great point. That's wonderful advice.
I learned that in my 20s the hard way.
Yeah. No, that's really, really good advice. I mean, so it just all goes down to like, what are your principles when getting involved with investing, when you get involved with anything in life, really like take time to reflect before you get involved with something or, pursue, whether it's a hobby, something you're interested in doing, profession, whatever it is, know what you want to get out of that situation. And then, yes, like that things can always change in the future, as you're saying, but, um, dealing with volatility, dealing with uncertainty, you got to go back to those first principles, and those can kind of calm your nerves. I believe is what you're saying. So that's really really good advice. So now we can then pivot to my next question. I mean, so you are very very involved in what the future of the internet will look like. You're a general partner at Gumi Crypto Capital, Silicon Valley investment fund with over $400 million in assets, including early stage investments in unicorns like OpenSea, Yield Guild Games, and the Celsius Network. So you're very, very involved in this space. I'm curious, why you think people my age should also be very excited about the future of the internet.
Yeah, so to me, like one of the things that I think is radically underestimated is things like exponential growth, right? Exponentiality is sort of vitally important. And the reason why it's so important is that like what you have to imagine is you have to imagine the difference in working in something that's growing versus working in something that's not growing, right? And so, how can you imagine something growing? So, one thing you can do with your mind's eye is like imagine, like, I know nobody works at an office anymore, but like, let's say you're at an office, right? Like, so the thing you can symbolize is you can symbolize the growth of that organization by the idea that they're empty chairs. And what I mean by that empty chairs is kind of like, oh, we need to hire a new CFO, or oh, we need to hire a controller. Okay, we need to hire new developers, right? Every single time someone says we need to hire, right, they should bring out empty chairs, right? Because those are empty
Mhm.
chairs, right? So to me, like, if you're in an environment where there's plenty of empty chairs, right, it just means that you have room to breathe. And it means that if you want to explore, like, it's like, oh, I want to try software development. Like, everyone will be happy to see that. Everyone will be like, go over there, fill that chair. Like, it's empty, right? Like,
Mhm.
go do it, right? Do whatever your dream, like follow your bliss, right? And so that expanding feeling is so critical, right? So to me, like, if you're a person who's a younger person, like you should definitely try to think about, reason about like things that are growing. One of the things that kind of is complicated about today is that we're living in an era of like exponential problems, right? Like, for example, if you look at things like global climate change, or if you look at things, like people think that that's exponential, because of things like, oh, well, okay, we lost the permafrost in Greenland and now we're seeing outgassing of methane, right? So it's sort of like, oh, not only did we lose the permafrost, but now we're getting even more carbon, right? So it's sort of like, wow, like how do those cycles kind of like drive exponential negative change, right? And things like pandemics, those are obviously very exponential, right? And exponential phenomenon and problems, it's kind of like by the time you think you need to start fixing it, like the genie's out of the bottle, like it's too late, right? So to me, the thing that's interesting about this is like, how can you identify exponential solutions, right? Which is why I've always been excited by both kind of technology as well as things like social movements, right? Because
Hmm.
social movements have a network effect, so they can become sort of part of a revolution, right? But I think as well, the thing that's exponential becomes like the growth of technology. So to me, when I think about blockchain technology, I really think about the three primary waves, right? And it's so one of the waves that was really powerful at the beginning when I was in my 20s was this kind of concept called Moore's law. So Gordon Moore was an Intel pioneer, and he basically asserted that every 18 months the number of transistors in a chip doubles at the same price, right? So the thing that becomes insane is that the computing power would just keep doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, right? And if people understand what it means to double and then double again and double again, like it gets bananas. That people don't quite understand what exponential means from a mathematical perspective intuitively, right? But here's what it means. What it means is that there's a couple companies that are pushing 3 trillion, and those are Apple and Microsoft, and those are entirely driven from that era, from Moore's law. Like so in a sense, it's like, okay, that's a thing, right? And then there was like a emerging cohort of trillion-dollar franchises that were born in the kind of internet era, right? Which kind of like are the Amazons and the like Googles and the Facebooks, right? Like that whole cohort was driven by this thing called Metcalfe's law, right? Which is Metcalfe's law is basically the what's called the network effect, right? So in the network effect, basically the idea is that if Alice is happy that Bob is in the platform, right, then it creates this kind of ever accreting value, right? So if you think about the value of Facebook, it's kind of like, oh, my mom uses Facebook, it could be either positive or negative value depending on who your mom is.
Sure.
But like, but my point is that, if all your friends are there, then it has more value, right? So in a sense, like the network effect is super powerful, right? But what I'm describing is I'm describing what's emerging now with blockchain is basically this third
Both. Or is it a whole
wave.
new one?
Yeah. No, I think it's a third wave, right? It's a
Wow.
third wave in the sense that it's a novel technology platform that has an
Network effect.
accelerate. It actually has like an accelerated network effect, right?
Wow.
And what I mean is that if you're not only does Alice care that Bob joins it, right? But Alice is actually actively shilling to Bob. Right? Alice is like, you got to join this Bitcoin thing because if Bob joins the Bitcoin, Alice's Bitcoin gets more valuable, right? So in a sense, like
Hmm.
it becomes this self-fulfilling network. And if you do the math, it took Microsoft the 44 years to get to the first trillion in
Mhm.
enterprise value, a lot faster to the second, right? Apple's working on the third, right? So
Mhm.
it's gotten really interesting. But like if you look at Google in that cohort took exactly half the time. It took 22 years, right? And if you look at Bitcoin took almost exactly half that time. It took 12 years to get to the first trillion, right? So in a sense, you have to kind of look at this as the acceleration of the adoption curve, right? So in a sense, like, the thing that's really crazy if you look at something like a Bitcoin is Bitcoin has tracked the price has tracked the proportion to the number of active wallets over 5 orders of magnitude, right? So the amount of correlation between these numbers is really insane, right? And basically, what Dan Moorhead from Pantera says is he basically says that like if you follow this correlation, eventually Bitcoin will get everyone on Earth and if it does that, then it should probably be at least $700,000 per Bitcoin, right? So, to me, like all of this is like may or may not be true. And there may be things that happen with regulations, or there may be things with technology. There may come a better Bitcoin. Some people think that's Ethereum, so like there's all kinds of forces that, don't guarantee future outcomes. But what I did want to say is I did want to say that this class of phenomenon, the open source financial infrastructures based on blockchain
Mhm.
as an aggregate, are like definitely growing in a healthy way. And the question becomes sort of, what do you think? Obviously it's also filled with like chaos, and it's filled with bad actors and scams, and watch your back. But like, but there's definitely so far, incredible opportunities, and incredibly virtuous, hardworking, intelligent people. They're definitely there.
Miko, that was insanely well said. I really enjoyed listening to that. Wow, no, that was really cool. I mean, just hearing you like break all that down, and one more time. So it was Moore's law, and what was the name of the second law
Metcalfe's
that
law. Metcalfe's
Metcalfe's
law.
law
So
focuses on the networking effects? Okay,
yeah,
the
yeah, you should
networking.
Google that up. It's super interesting. It's basically the
Wow.
value of the network is proportional to the square of the number of connected nodes. It's a super interesting
Oh,
idea of the exponential increase in the value of a network, right? So, that's Facebook has a mild recruiting effect where it's sort of like, oh, 3 out of 4 friends are in
sure.
there. I should go in there, right? But like it's nothing like Bitcoin, right? Like Bitcoin's a whole nother level, right? Where people who have it just aggressively shill to
No, I
people who
know,
don't. Like
and that's growing. That's
it's a
growing
little
every day.
nuts too, and it creates a little backlash too, because it's sort of like the body snatchers. Like it's kind of a crazy feeling.
Wow. Well, no, I mean, we live in a really interesting time, and I just love that you were able to really share with our audience why, it's good to be excited about this, but also do your own due diligence, do your own research, and really stick to your first principles. I mean, that's really important as well. Miko, I really just enjoyed this discussion a lot. Just want to say thank you so much for joining in their 20s and talking about your professional journey, what you were doing in your 20s, but most importantly, what our audience should be doing in their 20s. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.